The First Battle of Ypres produced one of the most enduring German legends of the war. Like most legends, there's some truth and some probably fabricated. In an effort to drive the Allies from Ypres and capture the Channel ports in the fall of 1914, the German army hastily sent tens of thousands of fresh, poorly trained recruits to form what became known as the Fourth Army under Crown Prince Albrecht of Württemberg. The story goes that these young student soldiers marched singing to their deaths by the tens of thousands. Even Adolf Hitler wrote about it in Mein Kampf. He was here during the First Battle of Ypres, and in his account he wrote this, quote, "With feverish eyes, each one of us was drawn forward faster and faster over turnip fields and hedges, till suddenly the fight began, the fight of man against man. But from the distance, the sound of a song met our ears, coming nearer and nearer, passing from company to company. And then, while death busily plunged his hand into our rows, the song reached also us, and now we passed it on." In November of 1914, German newspapers shared accounts of this same army of students. One reported it this way, quote, "West of Langemark, youthful regiments stormed the first lines of the enemy trenches and took them. They took approximately 2,000 prisoners, French regulars all," end quote. The story went on to describe how the student volunteers advanced silently through fog. There was no preliminary artillery barrage that might tip off the enemy. The volunteers are discovered anyway, and fire from a source they cannot see chops down their closely packed rows, arm in arm. They lie in the open, unable to advance or retreat. The news account writes, quote, "In this hour, they have become men," end quote. Then the miracle happens. A voice rises in song, then another and another takes up the holy words. The young soldiers rise up as one and storm forward. They sing as they run. Some are helmetless, their heads wrapped in bloody bandages. With their burning eyes, they are like an unreal figure from an old saga. In some versions of the story, the volunteers sweep over the enemy trenches. In others, the song dies as they die, and silent gray heaps litter the damp fields in front of Langemark. The German public began to refer to this incident by a name that was used in the Bible: the Massacre of the Innocents. Innocent child soldiers slaughtered as they charged bravely into the finest soldiers in the British Army. The truth is a little less compelling. There were certainly thousands of poorly trained student soldiers who fell in the First Battle of Ypres, and they were fighting against the best of the British Army. But they didn't die all at once in one grand charge by a single force on a single battlefield. And those student soldiers made up perhaps 15 to 20% of the total number of men who fell here. And yes, even some of the British tell stories of some of these young men singing as they marched into battle. But the singing was actually quite a common phenomenon on battlefields of the Western Front. In addition to helping with morale, it also helped to provide unit cohesion in the chaos and confusion of a battlefield. Now, those student soldiers who were killed in 1914 are buried here in the Langemark German cemetery. The cemetery here at Langemark is one of 13 German cemeteries in Belgium from the two world wars. In different sections lie the remains of over 44,000 German soldiers of the First World War. Nearly 25,000 of them lie in the Comrades' grave, the mass grave of unknowns in the center of the cemetery. Among those probably buried there are two of Germany's leading flying aces, Knights of the Air from the war. In another large section are buried men under grave markers with inscriptions. And then there's a third section of the cemetery dedicated to those student soldiers who were killed in the fall of 1914. So one of the things that just is so striking about coming to this cemetery is seeing the mass grave. And I'm going to come to the end of it here, right in the corner, because I want you to see all the bigger it is. That's it. Just to the end of where the walls are that show the lists of the missing, this is the mass grave. But in this small section of the cemetery that I could walk from one end of to the other in less than 10 seconds, lie 25,000 German soldiers. 25,000 in just this small area. I mean, the names on the walls just go on and on and on. With 48 aerial victories, Werner Voss was fourth among all German aces in World War I. In my opinion, he may have been their best pilot. He was a close friend of Manfred von Richthofen, with whom he would go hunting at the Voss family lodge when they were on leave. When the war broke out in 1914, much like Richthofen, he was initially in the cavalry. But in 1915, he transferred to the flying forces, where he trained as a pilot and was then selected to be an instructor. By April of 1916, he had achieved his 24th aerial victory in just under 5 months, and he was awarded the Pour le Mérite by Kaiser Wilhelm II. In May of 1917, he transferred to Jagdstaffel 5 and achieved his 34th victory. He was then given command of his own squadron. He was best known for flying the Fokker DR-1 triplane, and it was in that plane that he achieved his final victories, 22 coming in the last 3 weeks of his life. He was killed in a solo dogfight with 8 RAF aces over Belgium, where he disabled or damaged 7 of the 8 planes before being brought down. His body was buried in a shell hole near where he was found, but the location was later lost. And so his memorial here is a cenotaph. He is believed to be buried in the mass grave behind me. But it's also possible his body is still out there on the battlefield. Voss is not the only German ace buried in this mass grave. Erwin Bohm flew under the command of the great Oswald Boelcke. On October 28, 1916, Erwin and Oswald were involved in a dogfight with British planes. The wheels of Erwin's plane briefly touched the top wing of Oswald's plane, but that caused enough damage to the fabric of his plane to send Oswald to his death. Erwin was distraught at having caused accidentally the death of not only his commander and friend, but the man considered to be the father of German combat aviation. Bohm reportedly had to be talked out of suicide by his friend, Manfred von Richthofen. He did continue to fly, and he was ultimately credited with 24 aerial victories. He was awarded the Pour le Mérite on November 24th, 1917, but he died before receiving it. He was killed in an aerial fight with British Lieutenants John Pattern and Philip Leicester on November 29th, 1917, 1 month to the day after proposing marriage to Anna Marie Bruning. The statue behind me shows 4 bronze figures at the head of the mass grave. It was created by Munich sculptor Professor Emil Krieger. He was inspired by a photograph of soldiers from the 238th Reserve Infantry Regiment that was taken in 1918 of soldiers mourning at the grave of a fallen comrade. Well, that photograph was reproduced in German press, and it became quite popular in 1918. Unfortunately, one of the soldiers in that photo was killed just 2 days after it was taken. The statue itself was originally located near the entrance building of the cemetery, but in later redevelopment of the cemetery, it was moved here to its current location on the western end. So in addition to the tens of thousands of Germans who are buried here, it's believed that there are at least 2 British soldiers buried here as well. And their names are right here on the end of one of the tablets for the missing. It's Private A. Carroll of the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment, who died on the 4th of November in 1918, and Private L.H. Lockley of the Seaforth Highlanders, who died a few days earlier on the 30th of October. They're probably in this mass grave.